There were 6 death camps operated by Nazi authorities during the Second World War. And by its sheer magnitude, Auschwitz, which is the German pronunciation, was the most harrowing of the camps. According to Jewish historian Emil Fackenheim, it represents a scandal of particularity. It's a unique event in all of human history. He compares it to Dresden, Hiroshima, and other massive human tragedies, and says there's no comparison. The Jew, he says, cannot accept any such comparisons, and I'll quote him, "The search for a purpose in Auschwitz is foreordained to total failure. The very attempt to find one is blasphemous." But can we accept his judgment? Can anyone who holds to a biblical world and life view conclude that there is no purpose whatsoever? Can we see no role for the sovereignty of God over even this unspeakable manifestation of evil? Let's begin with a brief history, and we'll ask the question of continuity and discontinuity. That's another way of saying the uniqueness. Was the Nazi approach in radical discontinuity with the German or European past, or did it in a certain way build upon it, or something in between? In a few months, we'll mark the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Francis Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, with his wife in Sarajevo. This is the incident that touched off World War I. The war was the most significant turning point, perhaps, in global history since the fall of the Roman Empire. The 19th century had seen the greatest age of peace in Europe's history. Liberalism, that is the European sense of that word, had promoted a degree of toleration, constitutionalism, free trade, international economic systems. Europe had always shown a tendency to expand. Though colonialism developed at first, there was little overt conflict, at least on the continent itself. For 60 years after the Peace of Vienna, the Conference of Vienna that ended in 1815, there were few significant colonial rivalries. The European empires were based on trade. Of course, all was not well. In part, the success of their mercantile endeavors depended on slavery and other kinds of exploitation. Colonists raided the coastlines of Africa and took workers into the life of chattel slavery. Eventually, though, even though slavery was abolished, in some cases peacefully, in other cases not, racism not only continued, but in some places exacerbated. Everything changed in the latter part of the 19th century. We see an aggressive competition for territory. This was spurred on in part because of the Industrial Revolution. Now it was no longer enough to purchase local goods. There was a demand for more quantity, which could only be derived from various local countries by building mines, plantations, docks, warehouses, factories, railroads, and so forth. European countries vied for their part in the global South. The rate of change during this period of time is astonishing. During my grandparents' life, travel went from covered wagons to the jet plane. Goods were produced or farmed at home, but later you purchased them from a market and consumed them. Overproduction meant you had to persuade people by advertising that they needed goods, whether they did or not. Before the Industrial Revolution, such items as soap, clothing, food, and tools were mostly made at home. Afterwards, goods became more homogeneous, made in factories by machines. As a result, people went to work, men mostly, outside of the home, becoming more distant from their families. Declining wages often meant the mother or even the children had to go outside the home to find work. The seeds of change were also inspired by philosophical and cultural approaches that challenged the Enlightenment's more liberal thought. Darwinism, in effect, put into question the Enlightenment's ideal of liberty, equality, and fraternity, suggesting instead that human improvement was achieved by the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. Class warfare, not humanism, explained the movements of history according to Karl Marx. Courage and daring, not the traditional virtues, favored human advancement according to Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche will become a very important part of our discussion, as we'll see. The young Serbs who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand were avid readers of Nietzsche. They also read Bakunin, and their French and Russian counterparts were popular. James Frazier's Golden Bough never came out directly stating that the Christian faith was not unique. It didn't have to, since Frazier compared rites and symbols found in numerous cultures with each other and noted their similarities. Though science still reigned, the idea of human beings as purely rational creatures was threatened from many corners. Sigmund Freud stressed the power of the subconscious forces. Music and the arts moved from picturing the visible world to tapping the deep-seated psychological motives in the viewer and listener. Vasily Kandinsky painted Improvisation 27 in 1912. It was meant to leave the visible world and take the viewer into the spiritual realm through music-like abstraction. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring in 1913 was, according to the composer, a musical choreographic work representing pagan Russia, unified by a single idea, the mystery and great surge of the creative power of the spring. As one historian put it, musically, Le Sacre is undoubtedly the most famous composition of the early 20th century. It had the effect of an explosion that so scattered the elements of musical language they could never again be put together as before. Within this social context, the principal powers found themselves more and more in conflict with one another. The Great War was unprecedented for sheer carnage. Walk around any village in Europe, even today, you'll find monuments with the names of the young men who fell during 4 years of conflict. My own grandfather fought in this war. Indeed, such monuments can be found all over the world, since the war drew soldiers from Asia, Africa, and North America. Over 10 million combatants were killed, often in horrible ways such as gassing. Millions of others were wounded. In France, 1,700,000 were killed out of a population of about 39 million. But the decades following the Great War were called Le Grand Deuil, the Great Mourning, not only for those who died, but for those who never would be born. Civilizations were destroyed and empires shattered. So great was this global conflict that it was easy to imagine if God was at work, it was in unleashing the terrible judgments foreseen in the book of Revelation, not in the advancement of the kingdom of heaven through evangelism and missions. Yet, was there anything going on for the advancement of God's kingdom? There were many things. It was an era where, believe it or not, missions consciousness grew rather than was diminished. And the 20th century saw extraordinary spread of the gospel to countries hitherto not very much on people's radar screens, but having been made so by the First World War. 4 years after rushing confidently into war, Germany endured what's been called the calamity such as the world has never seen before. There was shock and humiliation. And during the free fall that followed this catastrophe in Germany, three rivals tried to control the situation. The first was the government that conducted the war. The second were the new political councils, the Räte, representing the unemployed, including the National Socialists. The third was the Spartacus League, which then became the Communist Party. When the humiliating armistice of 1918 was signed, signers became criminals in the eyes of fellow Germans. The Treaty of Versailles was the peace terms of the enemy, and it threatened everyone, so the Germans felt. The treaty was even a rallying cry for resistance and the end of the present government. The enforcement of the treaty was left to France. It was the end of the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollern, and the Ottoman empires. Germany lost 14% of its lands, including the Polish corridor to the North Sea, and including Alsace-Lorraine. Several million people suddenly became Polish. The military was vastly reduced. Heavy weapons were banned. Reparations were required of Germany. All of this led the prescient John Maynard Keynes to predict a massive Armageddon-like revenge. Stephen Osment, the great historian of Germany, calls this the perfect storm. Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in this atmosphere. The social and political circumstances that characterized this interwar period in Germany was the perfect place for a party of resentment to be born. Many Germans could not concede their country's defeat in World War I, arguing that backstabbing and weakness in the rear had paralyzed and eventually caused the front to collapse. The Jews, and this is most important, they claimed, had done much to spread defeatism and to destroy the German army. The Jews, it was believed, were in charge of so many of the financial and political institutions, and it was a Trojan horse. Democracy in the Weimar Republic, they argued, was a form of governance that had been imposed on Germany and was unsuited to the German nature and way of life. They construed the terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty and the steep compensation payments that it entailed as revenge by the victors, a glaring injustice. Such frustration, together with intransigent resistance and warnings about the surging menace of communism, created fertile soil for the growth of radical right-wing groups in Germany, spawning entities such as the Nazi Party. In 1925, a transitory economic upturn and a promising political dialogue brought relative calm into sight. However, the severe international economic crisis that erupted in 1929 carried instability to new heights. In 1919, Adolf Hitler, a released soldier wounded in World War I, joined a small and insignificant group called the National Socialist Party. He became the group's leader and formulated the radical and anti-Semitic principle of its charter. He spent a good deal of time in Vienna, where there was a great deal of anti-Semitism. In 1923, party activists led a revolt and tried to seize power in Munich, but failed. Hitler was put into prison, during which time he wrote his venomous book, Mein Kampf, roughly My Struggle. In the book, he expressed his ideas about racial theory and Nazi global dominion. He had read much of Nietzsche. He loved Richard Wagner, though I would argue that the connection of Wagner to Nazism is not a probing one. Books by Gobineau and H.S. Chamberlain, who based their anti-Semitic views on racial theories that were pseudo-scientific, were made available. And then Hitler suddenly became the comeback kid. What was his religion? He was some sort of lapsed Roman Catholic. He was critical of its traditions, and he believed that new rules for life needed to be made, regardless of what the church might or might not think. Hitler realized that he must employ legitimate democratic means in his struggle to seize power. However, he and his associates left no doubt about their belief in democratic freedoms as mere tools by which power may be attained. So after his release from jail, Hitler reorganized the party. In the 1924 Reichstag elections, the Nazi Party received 3% of the votes cast and was represented in the parliament by 14 delegates. In the 1928 elections, its support declined. The party was able to send only 12 delegates to the legislature. But then in 1930, a turnabout occurred. It was the first elections after the economic crisis had begun. The Nazis received more than 18% of the vote and sent 107 delegates to the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. In July 1932, with 230 mandates, they became the largest faction in the entire House. A political force that made an impact and acceded to power legitimately. President Paul von Hindenburg gave Hitler the mandate to form a government. So Hitler became Chancellor January 30th, 1933. At that time, the party had 2.5 million members. Now, there are many, many details which you can read about in the thoughtful historical books that have been written on this period. Hitler, in one way, seemed like an unpromising character. He failed art school. He was kind of a loser type. But he had a strange genius for mass manipulation. He was fascinated by the media. He was fascinated by the way you could make friends with high-powered people and gain their sympathies. And his doctrines included the call for more territory, a hatred for the Jew Bolshevik, and the cultivation of the Nietzschean highest man, which for him was the Aryan, based again on racial theories from the 19th century. It has been called one of the greatest scandals in human history. It was also the most costly mistake any country would make. In the 1930s, Germany's Jews, some 500,000 people, made up less than 1% of the German population. Most of these Jews consider themselves loyal patriots. They'd been in Germany for decades, for years, for generations. They have been linked to the German way of life by language and culture. They often excelled in science, literature, the arts, and in economic enterprises. 24% of Germany's Nobel Prize winners were Jewish. However, increasingly, conversion, intermarriage, and declining birth rates led some to believe that Jewish life would soon disappear as anything distinctive from the German scene altogether. As we know, it did anything but that. The paradox was that Nazi ideology stemmed from Germany and the German people, among whom Jews eagerly wanted to acculturate. Indeed, there was a widespread belief among many Jews in the illusion that the role they played within industry and trade and their contributions to German economy would prevent Germans from completely excluding them. Nazi anti-Jewish policy functioned on two primary levels: legal measures to expel the Jews from society and strip them of their rights and property, at the same time engaging in campaigns of incitement, abuse, terror, and violence of varying proportions. The one goal was to make Jews leave Germany. On March 9th, 1933, several weeks after Hitler assumed power, there was an organized attack, a series of organized attacks which broke out across Germany. 2 weeks later, the Dachau Concentration camp, located near Munich, opened up. It was principally a place of internment for communists, socialists, German liberals, and anyone else considered an enemy of the Reich. It became the model for the network of concentration camps that would be established later by the Nazis. Within a few months, democracy was virtually obliterated in Germany, and the country became centralized. We might say a totalitarian single-party police state. On April 1st, 1933, a general boycott against the German Jews was declared, in which SA members stood outside Jewish-owned stores and businesses in order to prevent customers from entering. Things got worse and worse. Approximately 1 week later, a law concerning the rehabilitation of the professional civil service was passed. The purpose of the legislation was to purge the civil service of officials of Jewish origin and those deemed disloyal to the regime. It was the first racial law that attempted to isolate Jews and oust them from German life. The first laws banished Jews from civil service, from the judicial system, from practicing medicine, and from participating in the German army, which was being massively reorganized at the time. Ceremonial public book burnings took place throughout Germany. Many books were torched solely because their authors were Jews. The exclusion of Jews from German cultural life was highly visible, ousting their considerable contribution to the German press, literature, theater, and music. And then, in September of 1935, came the infamous Nuremberg laws. These laws stripped the Jews of their citizenship, forbade any intermarriage between Jew and non-Jew, banned the Jews from universities, banned Jewish actors from theaters. The works of Jewish authors were to be rejected by any publisher. Jewish journalists were hard-pressed to find newspapers that would publish their writings. Famous artists and scientists played an important role in this campaign of dispossession and party labeling of literature and art and science. Some scientists and physicians were involved in the theoretical underpinnings of racial doctrine. The roots of evil were not only the Jews, according to Hitlerian theory, but also Christians and Bolsheviks. In a rather strange historiography, it was thought that the Jews had mobilized the slaves against the Romans, and then the Christians finished the job. This undermining of the Roman Empire was a huge mistake. In the 20th century, similar threats could be perceived. The Bolsheviks and the Social Democrats were undermining the German Empire. Jewish creations included democracy, capitalism, liberalism, internationalism, and modern art. They all permitted nobodies to become somebodies. After the eradication of the Jews, Hitler was clearly planning to eradicate the Christians. We know this from the documents. He blamed particularly the Apostle Paul for turning the masses against the great Romans. Karl Marx was clearly a descendant of the Apostle Paul. Hitler found the more liberal Protestants more malleable, but nevertheless needing to be dealt with as well. When the National Socialists came to power, they disbanded the Reichstag, began massively to rearm in total defiance of Versailles. June 30th, 1934 was so-called the Night of the Long Knives, a systematic murder of stormtroopers and any other perceived opponents. Territories were, quote, returned to Germany. In 1938, that would include Austria. Lands were taken from the Czechs and the Poles. In the process, we know that Neville Chamberlain gave much away. Germany and the Soviets together conquered Poland, but the Germans had no love for the Soviets. The war was on. Only Great Britain seemed to be left to stand for freedom. After the beginning of the war, Hitler implemented a policy that came to be known as the final solution. He was determined not just to isolate Jews in Germany and countries annexed by the Nazis, subjecting them to dehumanizing regulations and random acts of violence. Instead, he became convinced that the Jewish problem could be solved only with the elimination of every Jew in his domain. Not only Jews, but artists, educators, gypsies, communists, homosexuals, the mentally and physically handicapped, all those unfit for survival in the Third Reich. By the way, why did he call it the Third Reich? Well, the First Reich was no doubt the medieval period with its Holy Roman Empire. The second was presumably the German Empire, and then beginning with the National Socialists, the introduction of the Third Reich. It's interesting how very often historiography comes in threes. Think of Auguste Comte. First man was superstitious, and then he became religious in a more sophisticated way, and then he became scientific. It's often a three-part historiography, and the third part is some equivalent of paradise, the millennium. So, to complete this horrible mission, Hitler ordered the construction of death camps. Unlike concentration camps, which had existed in Germany since 1933, and were basically detention centers for Jews, political prisoners, and other perceived enemies of the Nazi state, death camps existed for the sole purpose of killing Jews and other undesirables in what became known as the Holocaust, or the Shoah. We will never know the exact number of victims. It is in excess of 6 million, including 1.5 million children. There were 6 death camps: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Auschwitz was the largest and arguably the most notorious of all the Nazi death camps. It opened in the spring of 1940. Its first commandant was Rudolf Höss. His dates are 1900 to 1947. Tomorrow we will see his residence and the place where he was eventually hanged. He had previously helped run one of the concentration camps, Sachsenhausen, and so he had experience. Auschwitz was located on a former military base near this town by its name in southern Poland. It's not far from Krakow, as you know, which is it's the second largest city in Poland. During the camp's construction, nearby factories were appropriated, and all those living in the area were forcibly ejected from their homes, which were bulldozed by the Nazis. Auschwitz originally was conceived as a concentration camp to be used as a detention center for the many Polish citizens arrested after Germany annexed the country in 1939. These detainees included anti-Nazi activists, politicians, resistance members, and luminaries from the cultural and scientific communities. Once Hitler's final solution became official Nazi policy, Auschwitz was deemed the ideal place for a death camp. For one thing, it was situated near the center of all German-occupied territories on the European continent. For another, it was in close proximity to the string of rail lines used to transport detainees to the network of Nazi camps. And tomorrow, if you haven't seen this, you will see the railroad going right through to the center of it. Not all those arriving in Auschwitz were immediately exterminated. Those deemed fit to work were employed as slave labor in the production of munitions, synthetic rubber, and other products considered essential to Germany's efforts in World War II. One of my very favorite, if you can call it that, survivors is Primo Levi, the Italian Jew who was a chemist by trade and who managed to find himself at Auschwitz, but not in the extermination part of it. At its peak of operation, Auschwitz consisted of several divisions. The original camp, known as Auschwitz I, housed between 15,000 and 20,000 political prisoners. Those entering its main gate were greeted with an infamous and ironic inscription, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. Auschwitz II, located in the village of Birkenau, or Brzezinka in Polish, I'm not able to pronounce it right, just outside, was constructed in 1941 on the orders of Heinrich Himmler. He was the commander of the Schutzstaffel, the Select Guard Protection Squad, more commonly known as the SS. This operated all Nazi concentration camps and death camps. Birkenau, the biggest of the Auschwitz facilities, could hold some 90,000 prisoners. It also housed a group of bathhouses where countless people were gassed to death, and crematory ovens where bodies were burned. The majority of Auschwitz victims died at Birkenau. More than 40 smaller facilities called subcamps dotted the landscape and served as slave labor camps. The largest of these, Monowitz, also known as Auschwitz III, began operating in 1942 and housed some 10,000 prisoners. These statistics are bleak, but they don't convey nearly the bleakness of the few testimonies we have of life and death in Auschwitz. When we finish, says Primo Levi, everyone remains in his own corner, and we do not dare lift our eyes to look at one another. There is nowhere to look in a mirror, but our appearance stands in front of us, reflected in 100 livid faces, in 100 miserable and sordid puppets. We are transformed into the phantoms glimpsed yesterday evening. If you've read his book, you will have come across one of the most famous quotes from it. You remember he was thirsty, and there was an icicle out the window, and he grabbed it to try and enjoy just the melting ice, and the Nazi guard took it and smashed it And Primo Levi said, "Why? Warum?" And the answer came, "Here there is no why." That's about as much of a summary of the meaninglessness of Auschwitz as you could find. Here there is no why. The physical dimension, the moral dimension, began one of the most horrible episodes in human history. One of Primo Levi's earliest observations was his own disinterest in keeping himself clean. The Nazis demanded that prisoners wash themselves. Strangely and ironically, this German sense of order was very present in these camps, including requirements for hygiene, which was practiced in the breach. But this seemed fruitless to him, given that his work coated him with coal dust and the washing water was dirty anyway. A fellow prisoner advised him that he should nevertheless wash himself, not to conform to the command, but as a way of reminding himself that he was still alive and able to resist his enslavement. Levi, who was from Italy, had trouble accepting this advice from someone who was from Prussia, since his own cultural belief was that nothing is of greater vanity than to force oneself to swallow whole a moral system elaborated by others under another sky. It's very Italian. Skirting the topic of cleanliness, he questioned more broadly whether it was really necessary to elaborate a moral system and put it into practice. Or would it not be better to acknowledge the lack of a system? And one of my favorite books of his, which is called The Periodic Chart of the Elements, it's not a promising title, but it's beautifully written. He goes through about 12 or 15 different elements, different chemicals, and he tells about the significance of each. The beauty of gold and the tenaciousness, of various others. And the fact that he's ordering this beautiful array and diversity is a kind of order without a system. And that I know of, he never became a Christian. He may have, we don't know. But this seems to me a very Christian kind of approach, to try to find some sort of beauty in the ashes. You might think that behavioral concerns such as cleanliness constitute only a small component of one's personal moral system, especially when juxtaposed against the more pressing concern of mass murder. However, as Levi explains, it is man who kills, man who creates or suffers injustice. It's no longer man who, having lost all restraint, shares his bed with a corpse. Whoever waits for his neighbor to die in order to take his piece of bread is, albeit guiltless, further from the model of thinking man that the most primitive pygmy or the most vicious sadist might have. His distinction seems to be about whether a person has the freedom to make basic choices. When someone's imprisoned and deprived of to such an extent that he can't choose to sleep or eat in ways that meet any needs, he's missing a foundation for his existence as a contemplative human being. According to this material definition of humanity, someone who chooses to commit evil deeds has more humanity than someone who does not have the opportunity to choose. Washing oneself is symbolic of the reality of the ability to choose to preserve a shred of dignity and the desire to fulfill physical needs. In the death camps, the unusual understanding of right and wrong were inverted. One was expected to steal from and not to help one's fellow prisoner. Being altruistic when one had already lost everything entailed death. Levi writes this: "We now invite the reader to contemplate the possible meaning of the lager," that's the Auschwitz dwelling place, "of the words good and evil, just and unjust. Let everybody judge how much of our ordinary moral world could survive on this side of a barbed wire." Behavior was thus influenced not only by whether one was Italian or Prussian, or a particular individual, but by the severe conditions in the camp that rendered existing moral codes inapplicable. The spell was broken and the moral metamorphosis reversed in an instant when the Germans abandoned the camp, leaving a few prisoners who were hidden during the chaos of the evacuation. Primo Levi records that in the early stages of this freedom, specifically on the cold day of January 19th, 1945, some prisoners worked to repair a window and stove. Others agreed to compensate them with extra bread. Only a day before, he wrote, a similar event would have been inconceivable. The law of the logger said, "Eat your own bread, if you can, that of your neighbor," and left no room for gratitude. And it really meant the logger was dead. By mid-1942, the majority of those being sent by the Nazis to Auschwitz were Jews. Upon arriving at the camp, detainees were examined by Nazi doctors. Those detainees considered unfit for work, including young children, the elderly, pregnant women, and the infirm, were immediately ordered to take showers. The bathhouses to which they marched were disguised gas chambers. Once inside, the prisoners were exposed to Zyklon B, which is basically rat poison. Individuals marked as unfit for work were never officially registered as Auschwitz inmates. And for that reason, it's impossible to calculate the number of lives lost in the camp. For those prisoners who initially escaped the gas chambers, an undetermined number died from overwork, disease, insufficient nutrition, or the daily struggle for survival in brutal living conditions. Arbitrary executions, torture, and retribution happened daily in front of the other prisoners. Sorry to go into this, but this is the reality. Some Auschwitz prisoners were subjected to inhumane medical experimentations. The chief perpetrator of this barbaric research was Josef Mengele, a German physician who began working at Auschwitz in 1943. Mengele, who became known as the Angel of Death, performed a range of experiments on detainees. I can't go into the next thing, it's just too cruel, but he worked on children. And he actually escaped to South America, and they never really found him. They did finally find him a few weeks before he died. But he's one of the few that the Nazi chasers weren't able to track down. As 1944 came to a close and the defeat of Nazi Germany by the Allied forces seemed certain, the Auschwitz commandants began destroying evidence of the horror that had taken place there. Buildings were torn down, blown up, or set on fire. Records were destroyed. In January 1945, the Soviet army entered Krakow. The Germans ordered that Auschwitz be abandoned. Before the end of the month, in what came to be known as the Auschwitz death marches, an estimated 60,000 detainees, accompanied by Nazi guards, departed the camp and were forced to march to the Polish towns that were some 30 miles away. Countless prisoners died during this process. Those who made it were sent on trains to concentration camps in Germany. When the Soviets entered Auschwitz on January 27th, they found approximately 7,600 sick or emaciated detainees who had been left behind. The liberators also discovered mounds of corpses, hundreds of thousands of clothing pieces and shoes and the rest of it. Tomorrow we'll see some of this, and we'll have to ask the question, is there any meaning to it at all? Is it enough to say, God is sovereign? Human beings are cruel beyond measure. Is this an incomparable act of systematic cruelty, or does it have parallels, not just in some of the other great human tragedies, such as Stalin's purges or Pol Pot's killing fields, but also in some of the biblical accounts of great judgments, great upheavals the great cruelty of nations like the Chaldeans and so forth. Without giving a definitive answer to that, I do believe if we say with Falkenhayn that this experience was entirely unique, we then mystify a part of the creation, a part of the fallen world, a part of God's plan for humanity in a way that makes him seem far away from all of these events, far away from being able to give meaning to them. And I don't believe, as biblical Christians, we should find that acceptable. The first time I visited Auschwitz, I was with my friend David Robertson, who's a minister in Dundee. And as we got closer to the camp, he said to me, "Bill, it's Auschwitz that led me to become a Christian." I said, "David, what are you talking about?" He said, "Yeah, when I was a young man, I struggled so much with good and evil that I needed a transcendent standard that is so authoritative, so self-defining, that it could even give some meaning to the evil of Auschwitz." And it led me to Christ, because the Christian God, the biblical God, is such a God. There are parallels to this in the conversion of a number of remarkable people in recent times. One of my favorite stories to recount is the conversion of the poet W.H. Auden. I had the opportunity to meet him when I was in college, and he was an older man, fascinating man. In the 1930s, he became a kind of typical British left-leaning humanist. The problem of man is he's hemmed in, he's limited, doesn't have enough money. If we can change these circumstances, then his goodness will emerge. And that was very typical of many of the intellectuals of the 20s and 30s. In fact, many of them looked to the Soviet Union without really going there as a real hope for a way out beyond the kind of right-wing nonsense that we've been talking about. So in 1939, he moved to New York City, to the German part of New York, Yorkville, which is still Germanic today, but in those days, the language on the streets was German. You know, you shopped at delis, you sent your kids to German schools. And he and a friend went to the cinema one evening, and they saw a historical, a news clip, and it was pictures of Hitler with his tanks invading Warsaw. You've probably all seen them, they're infamous, just massive destruction. And in the audience, he heard several people cry out, "Kill them, kill the Poles." And when he left the theater, he recounts in his memoirs that two things left him forever. One was his left-wing humanism. These are human beings, not Germans. They're just people crying out with such hatred. How can humanism be true? And the second was, like my friend David, he needed a God, a standard, an other that is able to define good and evil for us. Because if there isn't one, then it'll be some Hitlerian monster that will define good and evil for us. He wrote some poetry about this. And I think that's not a total answer to Auschwitz, but I think it's the right direction to move in. When we're confronted with such unparalleled evil, the first question that comes to our mind is why? But even as we ask that question, there's an implicit answer in it, because we're asking the question to someone. We're asking it of someone. And the question is that someone transcendent enough, self-defining enough? Has this person revealed himself sufficiently enough so that we can say, while we don't understand the details, how could this happen here, now, in such a systematic way? Yet, we refuse to say that there is no reason. So I've read not every commentary, you couldn't, but I've read just about the most important ones, both from the Jewish and the Christian and secularist sides of things. And on the Jewish side, particularly people like Elie Wiesel, what I love about him is his stark realism. You can't call this anything else but evil. But what frustrates me about it is that he therefore comes to the conclusion, if there's a God, we can't know him. He's silent. And that's typical of many, many Jewish reactions. This is so horrendous. If there's a God, we will never know. Some actually were just atheists, but most of them aren't willing to go that far. Whereas in the biblical view, we can begin very frankly with identifying evil as evil. And people like Elie Wiesel help us do that. If you're unwilling to face who you really are, ask yourself, if God were not looking, or if you removed some barriers, would I be capable of certain things? And the honest answer is, yeah, I would. So facing evil, but then when we face it, we have to have a framework within which, like Auden, to call it evil. And that framework leads us to the Creator God who permitted the fall. But then third, of course, is there any answer? And without being simplistic or trite or taking shortcuts, we have to say that the answer to the problem of evil, whether it be this horrific, harrowing depth of evil that we're going to see tomorrow, or whether it be what seems on the surface to be less serious, but in Jesus' language on the Sermon on the Mount is every bit as serious, like swearing at your neighbor. That has been atoned for. That's been dealt with by Jesus Christ. He is the God who took on human sin, became sin for us, took on the evil, and that's an amazing answer. Now, it doesn't say, I know why Auschwitz happened, or why God decided to allow the killing fields, or to allow, the death of a child by leukemia. It doesn't. The Bible rarely does that. Every now and then we have an eye open. Jonah. He knew he was the guy causing the storm, and he jumped in he had himself thrown into the sea, and the storm stopped. Most of the time we can't do that placing of the finger of God. But we can say that Jesus was not absent from the Shoah, that Jesus' suffering has meaning for the Shoah. And contrary to so much commentary which you hear, that means the Shoah is not utterly meaningless. And much as I admire people like Fackenheim, I don't find it blasphemous, as he does, to try and identify some kind of meaning. What probably is more blasphemous is to say, oh, well, it's because the Jews killed Christ, or it's because they don't participate well in society or something. That's deep blasphemy, because the Bible doesn't speak to us in those terms. So the enduring questions are there. Yeah, were there extraordinary conditions that provoked the Holocaust? Yes and no. The tremendous frustration of Germany in the 20s and 30s was a backdrop which allowed the seeming justification of evil at a very, very deep level. But that's not entirely unique. When something is dreadfully frustrating to us and it doesn't seem there's a way out, our tendency is to blame someone or some group, or to find a reason to justify the unthinkable. And that's not just Nazi Germany. What we're so shocked about in Nazi Germany is that Germany was seen to be, in the 19th century, one of the greatest civilizations on the earth, producing some of the greatest literature and art and political thinking, and that this people should suddenly descend to such depths of evil and using their genius instead of for human flourishing, for the destruction of human life at such a massive level. But it's not utterly extraordinary. Can we blame it on the weakness of the Weimar government? Well, it was not a strong government. It did not respond well in certain places. But you can never blame a weak government for the likes of the destruction that we find in the Holocaust. Having said that Jesus is the answer, there were also remarkable counterexamples, one of which we're going to look at tomorrow afternoon. There was all kinds of resistance. There was indeed Jewish resistance, quite a bit of it. There was remarkable French resistance. There was resistance throughout. And then one of my biggest disappointments when London was the host of the Olympic Games was the things they celebrated in the opening ceremony was everything except the Battle of Britain, which I think is England's greatest moment. So, you know, yes, we don't see the links, but the strength that Jesus gives us through his resurrection power is manifested in all of these types of resistance. And we can go into, if you'd like, during the discussion, we can go into the role of the churches in Germany, and you know, was the church complicit, or at least silent? You know, and there are places we can see, like the Barmen Declaration was not nearly strong enough. So there was not, the Christians didn't all behave very, very well. A question that probably should be asked, although we would not know how to answer it by direct revelation. Could such evil be the result of demonic powers? My answer is absolutely. Demonic powers, though, feed on things like human hatred and wouldn't be able to achieve this dimension of evil without the complicity of human beings. But I don't see how anybody looking at what we're going to see tomorrow could say, well, it's just human contrivance. There's no supernatural element. Was it unique? I've argued in some ways, yes, because of the systematic nature of it. But in the most important ways, no, because it fits in, sadly, with the record of human cruelty and evil. A record, nevertheless, over which God is utterly sovereign and has given a tremendous answer in Jesus Christ. And so sympathetic as I am to Fackenheim and others who say, you just can't explain it, I would like to say, sadly, it is not unique. You can find it throughout human history, sometimes latently, sometimes in a full-blown way. And finally, if you visited most of the Holocaust museums, there's a slogan, never again. And though there's no reason to hope that we'll have such a utopian life, that such a thing will never happen again, nevertheless, I think it's extremely important to educate ourselves and our children in what did happen, in the hopes that this will sober them up enough to do whatever it takes to prevent such a thing from happening, and to be aware enough of the signs of such a thing happening. Now, I don't want to take a cheap shot, and I don't want to make a comparison that many Jewish people resent. But I have to ask, in Europe and in North America, have we seen the signs of a similar, almost scientific kind of destruction of human life with abortions? I know these are not grown people. It's not the same as losing your aunt in the Holocaust, I know. But nevertheless, these are human beings. And they're destroyed at a scale that makes Auschwitz look modest, if you want to put it that way. So if we're bold enough to ask the question, never again, are we also looking at the signs in our own times of, the factors that led to such a thing as Auschwitz, and have we recognized it in our relaxed attitudes towards abortion on demand and so on? So I'd like to end on a note of hope, because it's pretty bleak what we're talking about. And tomorrow you'll be numbed, I think. But the biblical hope that we have is that there is a power and a goodness that far outstrip and are far greater in every way than the power of evil. So greater is He, this God we have, than any attempt, however harrowing and disconcerting and however demonic it might be on the part of evil. The power of Jesus Christ, who nailed the demonic forces, the principalities and powers, the laws and so forth on the tree, is in the end an incomparably greater power than the power even of a camp like Auschwitz that was so inhumane and so destructive. And the power of life in Christ is a power that if we only saw it properly, we would understand is not worthy of being compared with the power of evil, if only we could believe that. So I believe, and we'll have to go into this in some of the questions because it's not a trivial matter. I believe in the gospel we have the answer, not the equations that explain why this happens in this time and who was the bad guys and so forth, but we have the answer for the problem of evil.